It could be one of the most important political and financial story of the months, if not of the season. And we are speaking about possible bailout of the biggest Ukrainian bank called PrivatBank. It started with the change of the regulations of the nationalizations of the banks by the Cabinet of Ministers in Ukraine. But this is definitely a bigger story with a lot of parties involved. The bank is partly controlled by one of the richest people in the country, Ihor Kolomoyskyi. He has a control over some part of the assets, but there is a story with the national bank, with the president, prime minister, and even the IMF. We are here to explain the whole issue and its relevance to the region and explain it, put it into context. But before that, we propose you to hear what the representatives of the bank itself says to press and to the public.
The bank is not in crisis. There's no problem. In Ukraine, there is a crisis and the economy is in crisis. But in these circumstances, the bank is profitable and modern. For the past 2 years, there has been talk about the nationalization of PrivatBank. Our customers have heard this information before, and they no longer respond or react. The nationalization of our bank does not have any impact on our investors or clients, because it just means a change in the owner. If the government wanted the bank to undergo nationalisation, it would do so without a lot of fanfare and noise. This is different. The organisers are using the misinformation of nationalisation to create panic. So this will lead to people stopping their payments and to close down the bank. This is why we're not speaking about nationalisation, but instead we're speaking about a planned attack on the bank.
Well, we want to put a bit of in perspective, what does it mean for the Ukrainian economy and how big is the PrivatBank for the whole country? And I want to ask our producer to put on the screen infographics. Well, as you can see, approximately 50% of Ukrainians use the PrivatBank payment system in their everyday life, and a third of Ukrainians are depositors or use credit lines at the bank, which says for the country of 45 million, this bank is quite huge and systematically important for the whole financial system. Well, apart from the question whether the possible nationalization of this bank will affect quite feeble economic growth in the country that is still battling with the Russian invasion in the east and an annexation of Crimea, there are two other important aspects to this story. First of all, the role of IMF, which is related to the issue and how far IMF role can go when it comes to bailing out countries and demanding adequate response to the credit line. And the second one is obviously another important example of toxic relations between the state and oligarchy groups, because as we've seen from the statements from PrivatBank, they obviously treat it as not as a financial or economic issue, but more of a political one, again, with having in mind that President Poroshenko is related to his own banking empire. That is the only banking empire that has been expanding in recent years despite economic troubles in the country.
And of course, this is the sensitive moment, so it's very hard for the journalists to work because sometimes there is a freeze for the information. Of course, I think it could be very legitimate as there are concerns not to cause the panic among the people and the clients, but we really would like to explain how big it means to the country, and we're happy to have here Timofey Milovanov, who is the deputy chairman of the Council of the National Bank of Ukraine, a Ukrainian economist, and agreed to talk about the particular issues, in particular to explain what it all means and what the relevance to the economy and what we really are experiencing and anticipating beside the whole political context which anyway exists in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. First, let's just clarify that I'm a member of the Council of the National Bank, not of the board. That means our job is to oversee the board, and we're not involved in daily operations, and anything on the scale of dealing with a particular bank would be a daily operation, and so we oversee in principles. So I'm going to comment on the issues from distance. not getting involved into specifics of this particular bank. Also, I can offer some insight or some analysis of what is happening, because this bank is it's a systemic bank, and there's a lot of talk about this bank. The importance of the bank, of PrivatBank, is it's a large bank. It's one of the 3 systemic banks. There is a line in memorandum about systemic memorandum of the IMF about systemic banks, and this is one of the of many other banks which are undergoing stress tests over the last years, and they have to recapitalize or increase their assets or make sure they're solvent in multiple ways. And different banks deal with this issue in different ways, and that's natural. And some banks, in fact, become bigger. You mentioned Poroshenko's banking empire. I wouldn't call that empire. They're actually a set of international banks which have weathered quite well under the crisis, mostly because their owners recapitalized or added capital to the banks. And that includes foreign banks, city banks, for instance, from the US, European banks, as well as banks with ownership in Russia. Ukrainian banks have difficulty adding capital because the owners of the banks are Ukrainian, either companies or individuals, and Ukraine is in crisis, so it's natural that for larger international corporations or banking systems it would be easier to recapitalize. So it's not very surprising that Ukrainian banks have somehow more difficult time getting through the crisis. In addition, their business model often slightly too embedded into the Ukrainian economy, while the foreign banks or some other banks, including Ukrainian banks, take a conservative model. So this means that they experience larger losses potentially with their portfolio, and so the problems become more acute for them.
But don't you find it a bit disturbing or odd that after this stress test that is one of the demands of IMF, and presumably the government and other financial institutions went through it, the first thing that comes up is after this stress test is a nationalization of the biggest bank in the country, which can send tensions running very high abroad as a sign that the Ukrainian financial system is in such a bad shape that even the biggest bank is in trouble.
So in fact, the analysts around the world, the financial analysts, investment analysts, are pretty well aware of the situation within the banking system and also real sector in Ukraine. And this is really not news, the current state of affairs with specific banks, including with specific banks. Of course, there's there is confidentiality of information, and the very particular details of the situation is not known, but potential risks are even available in public information. In a recent financial stability report released by the National Bank of Ukraine, if I am not mistaken, last Monday, there is information about the banks, which banks passed the stress test and which have not, and many of the banks have not. And so the approach of the National Bank of Ukraine has historically been to give these banks some room, some time to bring their assets and their capital into accordance with some program. So the big bank we are talking about is not the only bank which are required or expected to add capital or to clean up their portfolio or do other steps to ensure solvency in the medium and the long run, and different banks respond differently. So this is not news. What might be news is whether a specific bank has fulfilled the conditions of adding capital and whether this recapitalization or adding capital has been verified. The governor of the National Bank, Valeria Hontareva, about a week or 10 days ago said that the decision to approve or not whether the PrivatBank has fulfilled the conditions of adding capital, so whether these conditions will be verified by the end of the year. So it's not very surprising that there is some discussion about how well the bank has met the conditions of adding capital, since the market expects that.
Timothy, in Ukraine, the politics and the economy and the financial sectors go so close. And, if every second Ukrainian has something to do with this particular bank, of course it creates some kind of a panic mode. And there is a feeling of the lack of transparency. And of course, if there is less information, the people are confused, and that already can cause the panic. So how do you see these things could be either avoided, because it really has an impact? And also, what would be the, let's say, a burden and possible impact on the Ukrainian economy in the country, which, anyway depends on the foreign funds and doesn't have really enough of money? That would be very blunt.
So if I can be a little bit more direct, the relationship between politics and big economic corporations or banks is present in other countries as well, including the very developed countries. So that's not surprising that we see a little bit of, or we in the media and elsewhere, we see some strategic leaking or not so strategic leaking of information. We see some posturing through media. We see different press officers making different statements. This is a bargaining game, which is about, again, the conditions on specific issues. This is normal. I think this is good news from a conceptual perspective, because Ukraine has a tendency of postponing resolving the problems. The entire issue with all the banks in the financial system is that cleaning up the financial system, making it solvent and stable, is important in order to start up the economy. But the bank, or many banks, can be operational while they are lacking medium to the long-term stability. So while on the surface they could be okay, and there might be even a chance that everything will be fine in the future, we cannot really put pressure on the banking system until it's clean. It's a little bit like an engine, engine is working, but we need to move forward and we need to get on the highway, not drive in the bypass road. And so the car seems to be working okay, but we know there could be potential problems. We need to check that car so we can bring it to the highway. And so the fact that this issue is being discussed suggests that there is, in fact, a serious effort being undertaken in order to make sure that the financial system is being cleaned up. Now, Ukraine has tendency not to do these things, not to do its homework. And the fact that, if this thing is resolved and we don't see much panic, and I'll comment on panic in a second, and we see that it's done professionally, whatever is the solution is, either the bank verifies that it has added capital, great news. Or the bank doesn't verify that, but then the government takes steps which are natural, makes sense, there's no panic, the bank is functional, so on and so forth. There's, 5-10 scenarios. If this has been done, I think that's good news that, in fact, Ukraine is moving forward.
But before we go into the panic, the issue of accountability, and again, putting in perspective, let's just not taking this case just as a separate. We have a long history of Ukrainian government, helping out owners of bank, let's just say that, who would bankroll their banks, then put the price tag on the Ukrainian taxpayers, and it's a history, long history of bailing out Ukrainian banks one by another and putting all the issues with paying up debts on the Ukrainian taxpayers.
So the worst case scenario could be when you have an insolvent bank, let's say in 2004, 2008, 2010, and that has been done, in fact, in Ukraine. The banker or the owner comes to the government and says, okay, give me money to bail me out, but I keep the ownership. Okay, I'm not going to add my capital. I'm asking taxpayers to add capital, essentially. Maybe under the name of refinance or something else. We will pay you back, but we'll pay you at a very low interest rate. Or maybe we will not pay you back, or, who knows. Or we will pay you later when the currency will devalue and so on. And that has been the history. I think what is in fact surprising is that so many banks have been closed that have not been solvent. Because the political process, as you rightly pointed out, tends to be, not only in Ukraine, but also in the US in the 80s. That's a classic example where the government didn't want to bail out or was too afraid to take hard measures when the credit unions went, or thrift institutions went insolvent because of high interest rates. You had up to 85% of thrift institutions being insolvent, and the government didn't take the right actions or strict enough actions until later, and then the price tag was 10% 10 times higher. So the issue here is that we're actually observing that the Ukrainian government, with whatever, little flaws or large flaws, actually trying for the first time in 25 years to resolve these problems.
But what could be possible, the burden and this kind of thing for the Ukrainian budget and this particular economic situation?
So first of all, when we are saying that something is missing, or maybe we need to add capital, we are talking about the longer-term spread. This is the numbers. We're not talking about the numbers which immediately will be released or the amount of capital which needs to be brought in immediately on any bank. So the bank is a machine which is operational. And when we see that something is missing, we are adding capital. That means we are worried that maybe tomorrow or 2 months from now or 2 years from now, we won't be able to meet the obligations. And so we need to ensure that there's sufficient capital to meet them. We are working for the medium and the long run. So in that sense, in the short run, they could immediately, tomorrow, today, there could be totally sufficient liquidity in the system. In fact, what we know is that in Ukrainian banking system today, we have up to 70, 80 billion Ukrainian hryvnias liquidity. There is structural distortion. Some banks are liquid, others are not, but we have liquidity. At the same time, we have sufficient non-performing loans. About 50% of loans today are not being performed. That's a paradox. We have liquidity in the bank, so the banks sort of have money. At the same time, these loans that they issued over time, they're not being performed. That doesn't mean that they will not be performed tomorrow. They're not performed. If the economy picks up, those businesses will get their own liquidity. They might be able to pay back. So we need to put capital in place now to ensure that out of those loans, some will not perform.
Well, the problem that the economy hasn't been performing very
yes,
well.
But again, it's a sort of egg and chicken issue. Until you have a stable financial system, which is prudent, and you don't have government, getting in the pocket of taxpayers every moment they have a problem, you can't hope that the banking system will start driving the economy forward, right?
Absolutely.
Timothy, so thanks a lot for explaining that. We'll closely watch out, in particular, this issue, and that would be probably really the big story, and we'll be back in a second.